Hi, this is Dr. Sana Hashmi. And this week in my Prince and I on China column, I explored a very intense topic that has been getting a lot of attention, and that is, of course, the closure of the Strait of Hormuz. And of course, this is the topic that is putting global energy markets on edge, raising concerns about supply chains, oil flows, and maritime trade. And India, China, and in fact, countries all across the world are getting impacted by this closure. So, on the Chinese internet, the crisis has drawn intense attention. Many see it as exposing the structural vulnerability of this choke point. Some commentators in China are calling it the most serious disruption since the Iran Iraq war. And hashtags like no ships passing through the Strait of Hormuz have been trending widely on Weibo. But at the same time, there is skepticism about a full prolonged shutdown. Um, and in fact, a Global Times article in Mandarin suggests that this remains likely that this situation remains prolonged. But tensions alone are enough to drive volatility and in global energy markets. So Chinese experts also point to the limits of escalation. For instance, Wang Shu from Beijing Foreign Studies University, who's an expert on Middle Eastern affairs, argues that a sustained blockade would impose high economic and political cost on Iran, which helps explain why the strait was never fully closed for a long time. But the conversation isn't just about energy, it's also about geopolitics, the factor that is actually driving the geopolitics of it. So much of the Chinese commentary highlights the hesitation of the US allies. US has asked allies to step up to support the US in this war, specifically given the risk. And the hesitation is primarily because the risk that were already faced by naval forces that were escorting ships near Yemen in the past. So the view is that deeper involvement in this trade would come at a disproportionate cost. And this is one of the reasons why now they are kind of hesitant. And some Chinese observers, scholars, commentators interpret this as a part of a broader shift with the US partners becoming more cautious, more transactional, and more interest driven, somewhat very much like the US. So I think now they're kind of matching the energy of the US, specifically where the costs are higher. And in fact, one widely Weibo post put it bluntly that allies talk loudly before a crisis, but they step back when it escalates. So this is what is happening in the current geopolitical situation. And alongside this, there's a narrative about China's relative position. Some in China argue that China may be better placed to absorb these short-term shocks, but there's also clear recognition of vulnerability. So heavy reliance on imported oil through narrow sea lanes still seen as structural weakness, and China would be impacted in certain ways. And this has sharpened debates around energy security. There are discussions about renewable energy being expanded quickly, and many argue that they cannot yet meet industrial demand. And nuclear power is increasingly being framed as a strategic solution, while coal remains a fallback. And in this context, Victor Kao, who's from Suzhou University, argues that China could sustain economic activity even under extreme supply disruption by relying on domestic coal. So, apart from this, diversification is another key theme, and this is something that China has been focusing on for a very long time. This is being highlighted within the Chinese discourse. So, pipelines from Russia, Kazakhstan, Myanmar, in which China has been investing for a long time, specifically since this has been intensified after the introduction of and launch of the Belt and Road Initiative. And all these pipelines, they believe that may be able to reduce dependence on maritime routes. While projects like the Power of Siberia pipelines, even Arctic shipping uh, routes are seen as somewhat ways to bypass choke points like Hormuz. And in contrast, where China is being seen as someone that is stronger even in the time of crisis, in Chinese discourse, India is portrayed as more vulnerable. And here, Tong Shimao from the Shanghai Finance and Development Laboratory is very direct in his assessment. He argues that India faces among the highest risk of supply disruption in Asia. He noted that about 85% of its oil is imported, with nearly half passing through the Strait of Hormuz. And this dependence is hard to unwind quickly. Strategic reserves are limited, refineries are tailored to specific crude types, and alternatives like Russian oil offer only partial, delayed relief. But at the same time, there's also some discussion about India's balancing act, maintaining alignment with the US while increasing energy ties with Russia. So that tension is shaping its response. Then, apart from that, there's also the security dimension that is added to the discussion, that India has deployed naval vessels to escort its tanker. And some on the Chinese internet are arguing that if more countries follow suit, more countries follow what India is doing, it could actually weaken Iran's ability to reinforce this blockade. So there are good interpretation and there are bad interpretations about India. They may be exaggerated to a certain point, but this is how India is being portrayed in the Chinese discourse. So overall, I would say in Chinese discourse, the Strait of Hormuz crisis highlights three things. The first is the fragility of the global energy dependence, and of course, it's being exposed even more now. Then the second is the limit of US influence when allies are now hesitating to support the US in times of its own crisis. And finally, a growing contrast between China's push for reliance and India's structural constraints. And of course, this is all Chinese view. So, to conclude, I would say that more broadly, it is a reminder that energy security is once again central to geopolitics. And what we are seeing right now is that the future control over key choke points continues to shape the balance of power. And this is definitely going to shape how countries equation with each other in the Middle East, and the potential spillover in the Indo Pacific is going to take shape. So I think we just have to wait and watch how the energy crisis will be addressed and how it is going to impact countries such as India and China. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next week.